Good afternoon. Welcome to Talent and Growth. Good morning to you, Matthew. Very early morning. Thank you for locking on today. It's the Three Musketeers today. We're one man down. Danny unfortunately couldn't make it, but I've got no doubt we've got plenty of conversation to be had in this room. So we're going to be talking today about interview processes and how to get the most out of them, how to make them efficient, inclusive, effective, and what that kind of, hopefully we can come away from this conversation with a blueprint for what that really good interview process should look like. But before we get to that, of course, some introductions. So Matthew, good morning from New York. I think it's 7 a.m. your time. Thank you for locking on. Give us a bit of an intro to who you are and what you do.
7 a.m. Yeah, after a long holiday weekend too. So it's like our Monday here, of course. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on, Matthew Brunwasser. I'm based in New York and Brooklyn. Have head of people for Sauce. I'm not sure if you could tell. I decided to wear some swag today. But yeah, I have a bit of a different upcoming into HR and people through hospitality and managing people directly through there. And through COVID, found my way into recruiting and HR, and have grown through some acquisitions and some startups and corporations, and now back into the startup world, as I said, leading people for a international company that's only 8 or 9 in the US, but about 65, 70 worldwide. So excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Appreciate that. Fresh off Memorial Weekend, straight into a webinar. I love it. Reka, welcome back to Talent and Growth. Quick intro into who you are and what you do for those who don't know you.
Hi, my background is nowhere near as interesting as Matthew's. Mine's much more conventional, but a mix of both agency and in-house. I've pretty much focused on tech my whole career. I've built teams, I've built processes, particularly interview processes from scratch. It's something I'm super passionate about, particularly as you know, Paul. I'm really passionate about DE&I, and the two things actually go really close together. And really excited to be here. Advance warning for everyone, I am not 100%. So if you hear a cough suite in the background or a cough, I apologize in advance.
No worries at all. Thanks for being here. Thanks for soldering on. And look, even a 50% Reka is going to be good enough for Talent and Growth. So don't worry about that. We're going to be all good. So let's get into it. So we're going to break down the various components of the interview process. But if we could just, I suppose, start off with a general question around this. And Matthew, I'll start with you. So for you, when we're talking about what an effective interview process looks like, something that assesses skills but still gives good experience, what are the key components that stand out to you? Do you know those boxes that need to be ticked?
Yeah, when it comes to interview process in particular, because there's obviously, when it comes to the search or recruiting interview process, just one of many ways that impact that search. The interview process, to me, I view it as one long interview. That's always how I've viewed it, rather than each interview being its own piece. I view it as one long interview. And the reason I do that is because you don't need every person coming on asking, hey, tell me about your experience. Tell me about what you've done. Because that wastes 10, 12 minutes each interview process. So I find it very important that when you look at the interview process, the people involved, the questions being asked, the interviews being had, whether it's technical or take-home test or an actual face-to-face, it's very important to just not overlap so much. And so, we've been in interview processes in the past where hiring managers were doing 3 interviews or 2 interviews or 4 interviews just to go over different things rather than consolidating into 1 or maybe 2 if need be. But I think it's just very important to get the right stakeholders in. Sometimes we overdo, but they need to speak with this person and it would be good for them to speak to this person. So I think the few things that determine are who are the most important stakeholders that need to speak to this person, and what is the minimum amount of information we need to make a decision here. Because I think a lot of times we assume that it's the same role we're hiring in the past. Do we need all the same information we had in the past? But sometimes I feel like we should learn from interview processes. You hired once, what worked, what didn't work. The next one shouldn't be exactly the same always. And so I always think it's important to iterate, but always make sure you understand what is the most minimum information possible that you can get through, because it's a challenging world to hire right now, and going against, especially as a startup, going against some big corporations or companies who are very, very aggressive in their hiring. we can't waste any time through the interview process, or else we might lose traction on a great candidate who might go somewhere else. And so I think knowing the minimum amount of information possible that can get you through this role, as well as the most important stakeholders, should be determined, before, the process every time.
And for you, Matthew, how many steps should there be? Although it's one long interview, so I get that absolutely, but how many steps should that be, do you think? What's the magic number?
I don't know if there's one magic number for every role or every level, right? I mean, we just hired a ton of people in Argentina and across Eastern Europe with three interviews, right? There's a culture interview, there's a hiring manager interview, and then there's a peer interview. And that was all we needed. We were hiring, entry level or second or third level roles where people are coming in with 0 to 5 years experience. And the most important thing for us, being a company that's new and upcoming, we can't expect people to have experience doing exactly what we're doing. But if their culture adds, right? We don't look for culture fits, but culture adds. That's the most important thing for us. We can teach, we can show, but if they have the basic skills and the culture add, that's great. And all we needed was 3. Those were the 2 things that we decided that the minimum we needed was culture add and some sort of technical knowledge for our technical support role. They didn't need to have the delivery right. But then you go up to maybe a VP. We're hiring a head of sales at the moment as well, right? So when you're looking at a head of sales, we've had people go through a 6 or 7 interview process, because at the end of the day, especially for such a small company that doesn't have a lot of stakeholders, just because we don't have 4 or 5 stakeholders to speak to them doesn't mean there's information that's necessary that we're just going to avoid because we don't have those people. So, unfortunately for us, we're having 3 or 4 hiring manager interviews, which is our CEO, because it's really important for our CEO, who's bringing in someone to take over this type of role, to find the right person, right? So first role, 3 interviews. This head of sales role could be 6, 7, 8 interviews. I think the 6, 7, 8 should really be the maximum. I was at DoorDash. We started a project where we were auditing every single interview process for every single level and every role. And we were starting to find 10, 11, 12 interview processes. And it was a lot. And so they made a maximum for each level. Lowest was 3 or 4, highest was about 8 or 9. And you really should be anywhere in between that. Frankly, I think the sweet spot is that 4 to 6 number. You shouldn't really role. You shouldn't ever need more than 4. 3 to 4, I think, is great. For a higher level role, I don't think you should need more than 6. But if you need that 7th or 8th because you're including a take-home test of sorts or a technical test of sorts, then I think that 7, 8 number is that max. But that 4 to 6, I think, is the sweet spot for most of them.
Really interesting. Thanks, Matthew. Reka, go on.
Yeah, no. 4 to 6 just sounds horrific. And the fact that you could go beyond that. So do I think it can absolutely vary? Yes. Complexity, seniority of role will absolutely change the requirements of what you're trying to assess, how you can assess that, who they need to meet. So could it go beyond what I think you can do most interviews in 2 or 3 stages, or most roles, I should say, in 2 or 3 stages. But I think if you're doing anything beyond that, they should be out of the norm as opposed to the norm. Mainly because I think there's a balance, right, between making the process effective and getting the information that you want as a company, but also giving the candidate a really positive experience, a real good insight into the culture of the company, not just about the details of the role. But I think one of the challenges, I think, particularly in senior positions, actually, when you're interviewing for senior roles, is managing interviewer ego, shall we say, thinking that they need to be in that interview process, as opposed to trusting the core of either their peers or other people in the process, because that role has already been defined. You've already been able to break it down into, okay, outside of seniority, whichever, these are the key things that we actually need to know, and this is how we're going to assess them, and these are the people that they need to meet. You don't need to keep adding to that list. So so for me, the answer to the magic question would be 2 or 3. And I think actually, if you have a good internal recruiter, that's where the 2 can come in, because they can cover off a lot of those basics. I say basics, but even some of the more in-depth stuff that they'll be like, oh, are they a culture? Well, actually, you know what? If I'm putting the candidate in front of you, there's a degree of you need to trust me that I know what I'm doing.
For sure.
So you can absolutely cut off some of the work, shall we say, that the candidate needs to put in. But yeah, 4 to 6 for me would be outside of the norm, and definitely more for more complex or more senior positions.
I would only add that for us, we include, the culture screening, which happens before, and take-home tests in our interview process. So for most of our technical roles, we have a technical take-home test of sorts, plus the hiring manager interview, plus the culture screening from the recruiter. So just from that is 3 almost every single time. So that's why I say for us, 2 is really tough. And when it comes to candidate experience, also and I speak from more of a startup viewpoint. In our opinion, it actually only adds to the candidate experience speaking to a high-level interviewer for a candidate, especially at a lower level. Hey, we'd love for you to speak to our CEO. Hey, we'd love for you to speak to our COO. We've actually found that that's a very exciting thing for some candidates who are already made it through more of the technical or difficult parts of the interview process. That last interview is not usually to determine whether they're a proper candidate or not, but we have found that it actually drives a lot of excitement because they're able to talk about the mission and what brought us here. Now, when you're talking about large companies, right? Not everyone's speaking to the COO or CEO, but at small companies, we have to find wins, right? We have to find ways to win people over compared to some other companies, and we have just found that additional CEO kind of exec leadership interview has been we talk about the power of the CEO for us all. Sometimes there's candidates I find on LinkedIn and I say, hey, can you message them rather than me, just because the power of the CEO can really be strong in the interview process. But yeah, look, 4 to 6, I think the only reason why I say that is only because peer interview, hiring manager interview, culture interview, and take-home test, and now you're at 4 interviews. So for us, 3 to 4 would be ideal, but I do think when you look at majority of companies, 4 to 5 is probably average. Doesn't make it perfect, but I do think that's probably average when you take in every aspect of the interview process.
Thanks, Matthew. And so I asked a grenade of a question there, didn't I, with the number of rounds. So, Rekha, if we could come back to this, but also, just by the way, I've heard of, I have some friends who work in the banks, and the standard there is somewhere between 12 and 15 stages for all of their interviews. So it goes, where do you start? Rekha, I know you've done this with Armakuni, when you're putting together an interview process, what are those key components for you? What are those boxes we need to tick for you to be happy with it?
So I feel like you need to go back to 2 things: the job description itself and the career framework for the company. So you're going to have key competencies, you're going to have key skills, and literally break it down from that as to what are you assessing, as opposed to the interviewer turning up and going, oh, I feel like I want to discuss this today. No, literally structure your interview around the role itself. I think is probably one of the key things. That in itself means you can drive more consistency throughout the process. It means you can drive more fairness, and therefore, as a result, I say appeal, but be more inclusive in that process to more people. I think it's really important to be transparent. So the more you can share with the candidate up front, the better. I'm really not into interviews that you get the candidate in and the purpose is to freak them out and interrogate them. There are companies that still do that, and if that works for them, cool. But I don't like it. I don't really see the point. Unless that's actually reflective of what it's like to work in that company, then actually they're doing the right thing. They're reflecting their company culture through the interview process. So you're going to interrogate everyone every 2 minutes? Sure. Show that in your interview process. But for me, I think being transparent, being conversational, asking questions and actually listening to the answer, like active listening for interviewers, I think is super key. So it's not just, okay, I need to get them through that answer and then I need to ask a different question. Follow up, build a rapport with that candidate, actually pay attention to what they're saying. And prompt feedback, I think. So no one wants to do an interview and then a week later still not know where they stand. So being able to have agreed SLAs with your internal team around when they're sharing feedback, I think is really important. Ideally, you'll build in some automation so that you don't have to chase them all the time. They'll get that automatic chase themselves. And you know what? Let's be honest, even if you do all of those things, you're not always going to get the feedback in the time that you would want or that is ideal. Tell the candidate, be honest with the candidate as to where and what's going on. I'm sorry, people are out of the office. I'm sorry, they're away. I'm sorry, you know what? Everyone's just really busy right now. You're not any less important, although I would argue it probably seems that way for the candidate. So I think prompt feedback, and prompt and useful feedback, I think is really important.
Yeah, some really, really good stuff there. And just while you were talking about all these absolutely correct components of what a good interview should look like, one thing sprang to mind. And bear in mind, I spent a lot of time in recruitment agency world and talk about putting people under pressure. So I was in an interview and I was not the main, I was the second manager, if you like. So there's a more senior person came in with me to interview a grad. And the senior manager came in, he got the CV off the table, ripped it up, and then said to the candidate, wants to hire you.
Gosh. I mean, like, there is a degree of, though, right? Like in a sales environment, because that's what it's like when you work agency, like there is a degree of you are under that constant pressure. So again, if that reflects your culture, fine. But for me, what I have always found is like you don't get the, like, irrelevant of whether it's reflecting your culture, you're not getting the best from that candidate by putting them in that situation. Very few people do their best when they're in that sense of fear or under that level of pressure. So actually just trying to build that rapport, making it conversational, I think find that often just works better. You as a company get more from it than ripping up the CV in front of them.
Well, I'm glad we've progressed in the world with interviews anyway. Matthew, so you mentioned one long interview, which I like that. I like that way to kind of frame it. What are you doing to make sure that process is consistent and authentic? And bearing in mind you are linking up different departments and hiring managers, but what's the glue that's holding it all together?
Yeah, I think it's having an early structure that can, right? So it depends on where you're entering the stage, right? So as Rekha said before, she's built interview processes from scratch, and we've entered places where have had interview processes built out, right? So I think it's different when you're in both situations, but I think early on it's so important to try to build that structure first rather than waiting to we'll go as fast as we can early just so we can hire people, and then at a certain point we'll go back and we'll implement interview structures and processes. And for I'm actually at that point right now where we've been building interview processes for new organizations and teams that we've been creating as we go, because like I said, we're 8 people in the US. We've been hiring in Argentina where we had 2 people. Now we have 15 people. So we build these processes early, even if the right people aren't here yet and multiple people have to kind of fill in for these interview processes, because at least we know the structure is there and those people can come in and enter at the right time. But I think the most important thing is something Rekha also mentioned before, is like building that trust with not just the hiring managers. Frankly, I find that the actual hiring manager has more trust than a lot of times, whether it's their superior or the CEO or COO, like wherever you might be, if it's a small company. A lot of time getting the buy-in from the person who's actually making that final decision or managing the budget for this organization, that's the hardest person to get buy-in from sometimes, because they're not always part of the interview process, whether it's a finance person, a CEO, the VP or head of a department. They're not always part of that interview process. They don't speak to the candidate. And so I think really building the trust with people outside the interview process who are important to that budget or that organization is huge. Really getting buy-in from people who will interact and will work with these candidates or these people filling these roles is just as important as building that structure in the process for these interviewers and hiring managers. But yeah, when it comes to building questions and each part of the interview process, it takes time and work. You sometimes even need to test some things out and try some things before you get to the final questions that you're going to be using. You're going to have to test out interview people. we use this person in the interview process. We realize now that doesn't make sense. They had a conversation, it doesn't work. So I think it's about iterating. Like I said before, is just, you never have a perfect interview process. I think there's always way to build and have a better interview process, but it starts at the beginning. You have to build structure. You have to get buy-in from the right people internally in the process, but especially people outside the process who will be interacting with these folks as well.
Thanks, Matthew. Reka, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so I find we all do a kickoff meeting when we get a new role come through. We're defining the role. We might be writing the job description. At the very least, you're definitely writing the job ad, and we talk about how we're going to source and all of those kind of things. But what we don't often do, that I've been doing, is what's really useful. You get all of that done, but then before you even start interviewing, before you even start reaching out to candidates, is to do a kickoff meeting with everyone in that process. So not just the hiring manager. If they're interviewers, if they're key stakeholders, as Matthew said, anyone that's got a potential say in that process or is going to be in part of that process, do a meeting, get all aligned on what it is that you're even trying to achieve. Because the amount of times, I say even just a dev, but it doesn't matter what the role is. And you all think you're looking for different things. Like, it might be really clear to one person, but that might not be the same thing for everyone. So get really aligned on what you're trying to actually achieve by the new hire, and by what each of the parts of the interview process itself looks like. In terms of being able to try and build that consistency across the company, particularly across different departments, it's hard. It's really, really difficult. Like, how do you compare someone that sits in the marketing function and benchmark them in the same way that you would do as someone that sits in finance or in technology? So I feel like there's a degree of like acceptance that you can't do everything. But what you can do is, if you have a defined company culture, if you have defined values, being able to build that in as part of the process so that there's a degree of calibration on culture ad the whole way through the process, regardless of department. But then I think it's interviewer training. So making sure all the interviewers go through that training, being sure, kind of building on the kickoff meeting where you're then also doing calibration feedback sessions. So what a good Java dev looks like in one team might be different to another. Let's make sure that there's parity across the board on what that looks like, even if the finer requirements are a little bit different. And using candidate feedback. So it's not just us as a company giving feedback to the candidates giving feedback on what they have found the process to be, whether that be the questions, whether it be the people, whether it be the stages, whatever it might be, but asking them consistently for feedback. I think that really helps. And that can feed into kind of your data and your metrics around being able to recognize whether there's any particular challenges, whether that be around a particular interviewer that no one gets past because their bar is super high, or someone that always says yes to somebody, or maybe based on the feedback, actually the candidates have experienced something that maybe isn't aligned to that company culture. So I think as many different ways of tracking that info, I think is really important, outside of all the training that you can put in place. Like, that's only half the battle. Being able to actually assess it, I think, is the next thing.
In terms of that feedback piece, are you using a particular tool or automation to generate that feedback for you? Have you got like a Reka type chatbot out there doing it for you, or are you doing it manually? How's it working?
Yeah, so I haven't told you about this, Paul, but I have a clone that does all of this. No, so most ATSs have this built in, whether it be sending out candidate surveys or whether it be so you're not having to pay specifically for a separate tool. It may not cover everything that you need in the standard questions that they have, but then again, there's usually workarounds even within the system. There are other ways and means of being able to assess that feedback. But I think outside of the platform of what you're using to do that, I think it is like when are you asking? How often are you asking? What types of questions are you actually asking? For me, I think it's really important to have a mix of both quantitative questions and qualitative questions in order to be able to get that real mix. Like someone just hits 10 to everything, it doesn't really give you an answer. But if someone's saying, I don't know, I didn't feel comfortable in this interview, but that's useful. It might be a one-off experience, but you don't know that unless you're consistently asking the same question. But most ATSs have this built in, but there are tools out there that you can use as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
It's so interesting, Paul, just to hear these two very different perspectives of like our company. I wish we had so much set up. We don't have an ATS. We don't, we're very early in our stages here at hiring in the US. So I think it's such a great way to hear how a company that's very set up, how they organize and structure and how they operate. And for us, like, we operate very, very ad hoc because that's how it happens. Like things come up and sometimes you just have to change the process. We only have 3 or 4 people who can even participate in interview processes. There's not even more than that, right? So I think it's just so interesting, Rekha, just hearing how you're structured. I really appreciate your perspective.
Okay, so I've definitely been in that scenario where not only do I not have the tools, but I also have no budget to spend on anything. Right. And when in doubt, Google. So you can build a Google form that literally you can just send the link out and put that information together.
Oh, yeah.
And you can integrate from Google Forms into, I use Zapier quite a lot, but so that as and when something else happens, this happens. So again, building in that automation. So like there are workarounds if you don't have the tooling, but gosh, it's been years since I didn't have an ATS. So respect, I have no idea how you have that level of patience.
I've built a manual one, which is very, very interesting.
Cool.
That's interesting. I'd be interested to hear about that actually. But actually, I'm in a similar situation as you, Matthew. Sometimes because we're working with quite early stage businesses, and they haven't got ATSs, and so for instance, one company I was working with didn't have a careers page nor see a point in it because they thought, well, no one's going to Google our name and want to come and look for a job with us, are they? Which there's logic to that, but of course we know that the careers page is that window people need to go to. Just in terms of one thing I found when I didn't have an ATS, because I wanted to make sure I was getting feedback from candidates. An easy way to do this is I bodged a couple of things together. I use Calendly to book all my screening calls with candidates, and then I set up a workflow, an automated response from Calendly with a type form survey in it, and I found that worked pretty well because I didn't have that access to that ATS. So that's useful for anyone, and hopefully that helps. Moving on though, Matthew, let's talk about inclusivity, making sure our processes are fair. How are we making sure that we're providing an equal opportunity for all candidates, regardless of background or identity or whatever? How are we making sure it's a fair, inclusive process?
Yeah, and this is always hard. I think even when you try to do it, it's still hard because there's people who just have different access to things that you just don't necessarily know about. And it's hard to pinpoint how you access or reach those people. But, getting your jobs onto not just LinkedIn, but to other job pages that are more easily accessible for people who maybe don't have a LinkedIn account or don't know how to set up a LinkedIn account, but can search very easily, like you said, on Google or other Glassdoor or some other job pages that are simple. But I also think it's really important to put an effort into this. A lot of people just think, oh, well, I put it on all the websites. I put it on our career page. Whoever applies. That's who I'm going to speak to. But I think it's important to make sure, especially when you're tracking the data and the numbers, that you put an effort into finding people to bring diversity to the process. Because if you allow the candidates to dictate who's in your process, you're going to get most of the people who have the easiest access to applying to your role or reaching out to you or getting in contact with you. The other side of it has to be an effort on our side, whether it's the recruiter, the people, the hiring manager side, to really make it, whether it's making it accessible for others. And if you don't have that opportunity, right, with us, we have no ATS. We don't have something that just shoots it out to 10, 12, 15 different web pages or things like that. So it's really important for us to go and make the effort to get it onto some of those pages and to speak to people who are not, maybe who haven't applied and didn't even know about the role, but you're reaching out because you want to bring that diversity and bring that inclusion. But I'm not going to sit here and say that it's an easy task. I find it to be probably the hardest part of my job, is to just always ensure inclusion and diversity in the candidate experience and in the interview process. I think at the end of the day, there's tons of ways we can try to do this, but there's not a ton of ways that are tried and true, right? It's still something I think we're going through these days, these years. But the most important thing is to try to make it as accessible as possible for every individual, whether it's your website, different job pages, an interview process that's accessible to sometimes. Oh, well, let's do a video call. Maybe someone is hard of sight and a video call doesn't make sense for them, or hard of hearing and speaking to you doesn't make sense to them, right? Maybe an email chain of discussions is more efficient or better for them. So I think it's just really important to understand that every candidate you speak to is going to be different, and to not just assume that your interview process is going to work for them, but to adjust if for some reason it doesn't. Always be cognizant and aware, and ask what, you can always ask, hey, does a video call work? Is something else better? Hey, here's the video call link. See you there. Sometimes it's just an assumption that we make that you don't know who's on the other side. Maybe they take that a little personally. Oh, I'm blind. I can't see, and I've spoken to people who have responded and say, hey, you know what? Video call doesn't work for me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can we do this? It's not perfect, but if that's what's easiest and most inclusive for them to be able to join the interview process, there's no question that's what you need to do. And so I really think the assumptions we make sometimes in just putting it out there and assuming that people will get there, assuming that video calls work, assuming that phone calls work in person, you always have to be open to that change and make sure that you're asking people, hey, does this work for you? Is this accessible for you? Is this easy?
I appreciate you being kind of quite open around that, Matthew. And I think, look, every business is at a different stage with what they've got access to. But I think what's clear is your intentionality is in the right place. So that's really, really cool. Rekha, go on. I'll cut you off there. Go on.
No, you're okay. So I think there's two sides to this, which is, as Matthew was talking about, getting people into the process. So making the attraction or the outreach as open as possible in order to just have as many pools of talent available to you. Like, why are you making your job harder? Like that literally makes sense. So that there's that part. But then there is, in the interview process itself, how do you still keep those people through the interview process? How do you still keep them engaged? We've talked about comms and structured interviewing in itself being like super important, but then there's things like having diverse panels. So whether that be by gender, whether it be ethnicity, whatever reflects your company. Let's not try and get all fake the culture that isn't true. I've been on the receiving end of this. Like, they thought they were making me more comfortable. They were not. So let's be smart. You may not have that diversity in your immediate team of the people that would normally interview. So let's be smart and reach out to other teams, other departments, and like we talked about comms and transparency before, and this is a prime spot. We don't have any women in our company. We don't have any women in our team, or whatever it might be. Tell them that this is what the experience is going to be, and actually you really value their feedback in both what they're experiencing, but also how you're going to support them when they come into the company. So it's not just a case of, oh, we've ticked that box and we're done. Like that's not enough. We've talked about interviewer training already, and again, not just around values, but just doing your legal requirements on what you can and cannot say in an interview, I think is really important. I'm always surprised by how many people don't know this, but like, this is my job. I expect to know this. I don't expect other people. And so it's my job to be able to share that with them about what they can and can't say. And again, with the candidate feedback and with the metrics, to make sure that you're tracking what that looks like, to make sure that you're feeding back and spotting a problem before it becomes one. Or on the flip side, a really positive scenario and being able to shout about it internally. I think both of those are really important.
And when you're talking about the hiring managers and I suppose making sure people know what not to say, what they can say, how do you go about, I suppose, coaching them? Is this coming from that meeting at the beginning, or is there some separate interview training you're doing? How are you doing? How are you making that work?
So there's a couple of different ways of doing this. Build like the ideal for me would be building this in as part of the onboarding process into a company. So it's not a case of, oh, we're about to interview, can you do some interviewer training? Like building that in from day one so that there's a real clear expectation around what interviewing and interview process look like within the company. I think that's really important. When you tie that into, this is our culture, these are our values, and this is how we reflect it in our interview process, all you're doing is showing them what that looks like. These are not just words on the wall. These actually have real value and meaning within our business. I think those two things are really important. So ideally, you're doing that up front. There are some absolute legalities that, here in the UK that we definitely need to cover, our protected characteristics of what you can and can't say. Like, let's not pretend that is not a fun conversation. It is, when we don't have to put bells and whistles on it, but you do need to cover it, because if someone says something that they're not supposed to say, how old are you? I've actually been in interviews where someone's asked that question and then having to backtrack and explain. No one wants to do that. But if you've told them up front what you can and can't say and why and how, like, just get that over and done with. Ideally, you'd also be doing like bias training, and similar, and not just, oh, we've done it as part of onboarding, we don't need to do it again. Like regular cadence on not just the D&I type training, but like on just keeping that interviewer quality up there. And that might be reinforcing it when you do those kickoff meetings, and it might just be reinforcing it when you're doing calibration or wash up meetings post interviews. But there are a number of ways in which I think you can do that consistently. Ideally, you've talked about platforms that you can use, Paul, to kind of help this. No one's got the time to be able to do this one-on-one, or even one in a group scenario on a regular basis. Great if you do, but if you don't, ideally, if you've got budget, being able to build that in as part of your platform of training, I think that would be the ideal, because then it's self-service. And then what you can spend time on is, rather than, oh, these are the protected characteristics, you can go through, actually, this is what we actually need to focus on in this interview. This is how we talk about culture in this interview, rather than some of the slightly more boring but very necessarily legal stuff.
Gotcha. Thanks, Reka. Matthew, are there any types of, and this may not work, but I was interested to ask it, but are there any types of is there a toolkit of questions or prompts that you either use yourself or you advise your hiring managers to use to get a good interview situation going?
There are some that I suggest. I usually do an exercise to ask the interviewers to work on interview questions prior to the process really opening up, mainly because at the end of the day, as knowledgeable as I try to be on all the roles that we're hiring for, the different organizations and teams and roles we have internally, the hiring manager knows what they need to know to find the best candidate, especially because usually the culture stuff, the experience stuff is usually happening in that initial culture screening where I'm talking to the candidate. We don't need tons of other culture style or other types of questions in other interviews, but I'm usually working directly with those hiring managers or interviewers to come up with questions for them. Now, previous companies I've been at, we've had question banks, we've had people teams that have been responsible for coming up with hundreds and hundreds of questions that we add to a question bank, and people can go in, and depending on what organization you're hiring for, whether it's marketing or whether it's engineering or product or support, there's a tab on that Excel form or Excel doc that has hundreds of questions for that organization. So I think there are obviously different ways to do it depending on the size of organization you have, the different manpower you have, or woman power or people power in general. But overall, I think at the very least, some sort of exercise should be done beforehand. So it's not just, hey, you have an interview tomorrow, let me know how it goes. But the week before, you were preparing for that interview with, hey, these are the questions. Hopefully if you do have an ATS, you can usually build those questions right into that ATS. So you almost don't even need to speak to the person beforehand if you don't have the time. But if you do have that built into the ATS, and you can reach out before and say, hey, these questions have been built in, we worked on these together last week, try to stay on topic. I think that's definitely a way that we've built out like question banks from there. And then we take those questions and we store it, and we keep those questions over time so we have them at somewhere else. But when it comes to inclusivity, I think that's that's a huge step. Like if they don't know that there's a reason why consistency is there in the interview process, and it's to provide that same consistent experience to whoever might be joining the interview process. So if you really just make it clear that, hey, these are the questions, this is the guidance, we worked on this, it's built in for you, go ahead. I think that's the most basic step for someone who maybe doesn't have a full question bank built out.
Gotcha. Thanks, Matthew. Reka, anything on question banks at all that you'd add to that?
Okay, so most interviews are going to cover technical, competency, behavioral, problem-solving type questions. So, yeah, cool. If you've got a bank, great. I mean, that's my preferred. I think there's a balance between having that consistency of process, which is definitely required, but that authenticity of interviewer. Like, there are questions that I know I'm never going to ask because like I can't, like that's just not how I would ask it. So like there's a degree of prescription that I think type of question and banks can really help with that, as opposed to being this is exactly word for word what you need to say in order to build that consistency. So I think there's that. But for me, I think outside of the very specific types of questions, I think it's around two things, which we kind of I just touched on a bit before, which is asking really open questions, like just getting the candidate to talk and have that conversation with you. And really listening to be able to follow up and build on what they're saying. I think that is, I don't know about more important, but like that helps the experience itself for the candidate feel more positive. It helps you get the information that you need. And it still means you can cover all of those, the key areas, I think, throughout it. But I'll go back to all of those questions that you'll be asking will be linked to the core of what you're trying to cover in that interview, whether it be technical, whether it be culture or ways of working or whatever it might be. But yeah, link it back to that, I think, is really key.
Gotcha. Thank you, Reka. And let's talk about for a second project-based assessments or tasks. And I suppose, and I'd ask you to just think a little bit around as well, as you probably are, and I think about this all the time, is AI. And I think, and we think about, say, for software engineering, for example, the take-home task. There's no point in doing that anymore. There's actually apps now which will allow you to cheat on a live technical test, thanks to AI as well. So how do we fit these in? And is there a place for project-based assessments or tasks? Matthew, what do you think?
It's tough. You're absolutely right. I mean, we try to do live assessments. We ask them to share their screen, and to use a specific setting where it shares the whole screen, not just one tab. So, I mean, you really have to focus and like get pretty detailed in how you're offering this assessment. But at the same time, that kind of, it goes against some of the inclusivity side of it, where it's, maybe someone doesn't have the computer right in front of, access to a computer all the time to do that assessment, or, and so I think it's a really tough place because AI can do things I can't even imagine or think about right now. And so it's hard to stop something that has this power that you don't really even know very much. But I think it comes down to trust. I mean, how in the first conversations that you had with this person, were you able to build trust? Or did you feel that there was a passion for this? And I think Rick had mentioned something that was really important, of the open questions. Even though you're trying to find specific details and hear specific details, being open is so important, because if you're open from the beginning and someone is able to converse with you in a very specific way about different tasks and products and pieces of your business, and you haven't really given much, you've just been open and asking them to speak, that kind of builds that trust, right? Okay, they know what they're talking about. I haven't really given them a topic to speak about, but they're getting into the details before I even get there. And so I think if you're able to be open before that technical or that take-home test or project-based, assessment of sorts, and you are able to hear that openness from them, I think that's really where you're going to know whether, their technical test aligns with how they spoke. Sometimes you speak to people who you're like, oh, they could be a good culture ad. I'm not sure if they have the experience. And then they absolutely ace their technical and they weren't in front of you. And you're like, wow, that seems a bit off. Like they did not come across that way. And so I just think it's important to build that trust early in the interview process and learn about your candidate. I mean, that's why we have recruiters at companies. It's what we're hopefully good at, is reading people and understanding people. But being open, like Rekha said, I think is huge, and really building that trust from the start is how you're going to know if it's really tried. I'm not going to sit here and say I can beat AI yet. Who knows what it can do? Someone could have it running in the background. I'm not sure the ways that people can use it right now, but I am sure of the trust I can build with someone, seeing the passion and how they speak, their knowledge, their understanding of this before they get there. I think that is where I can really help or see that type of stuff.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with Matthew in that we don't know the answer to that. I just don't think anyone really knows the answer to how we solve AI. I mean, even before you think AI, just video interviewing. If we think about all those examples that you heard, particularly during and post-pandemic, about the candidate that interviewed and they performed really well, and then someone turns up and they're, is that the same person? Are they performing the same way? You don't even have to think about AI before you think about some of the challenges that we'll have to overcome as part of the interview process in itself. But yeah, AI absolutely adds a new dimension. I don't think we have an answer. What I do think, though, is if you are going to give a task, be really clear with your candidate and with your team around what it is you're trying to achieve. What are you actually trying to gauge? How are you assessing that project or the task that they're working on? I don't think it's a deal breaker to kind of talk them through the kind of competencies that you're looking through. You're not giving them the answer. You're just making sure that they cover those things. What's the worst thing that will happen is they turn up, they've answered the question, but they haven't answered the very specific thing that you haven't told them. That's a waste of everybody's time. So I think being open and upfront around that, I think, is really important. Ideally, if possible, you really want to build in some collaboration into the project itself. So whether it be, okay, they've had to go home with a brief and they can come in and they can present it to a team, and then there's an open Q&A. Okay, cool, that can work. If it's a technical task, give them a pairing task. Then you can kind of assess ways of working as well as their technical skill set. But I think ideally, the thing you really want to get, and you don't always win, is you want to make it as enjoyable as possible, as reflective as what it's like to do this job for that company, and reflect that in the process. If you're going to give them a 10-hour take-home task, ouch. But if that's the case, tell them it's going to take that long. I think you should really only be aiming for an hour or two in a take-home task. But you say an hour or two, most candidates will take longer. So just because they want to do a good job. And that is where I do have mixed thoughts around take-home tasks. Generally, it is unfavorable to those that are in underrepresented communities. Whilst both men and women can be parents, the bulk of the workload does fall to the mothers. So expecting them to take out time, especially when it's not just one interview, it'll be several interviews, it'll be with multiple companies, and expecting them to find time to be able to do that. Those that might be carers, those that have, second job, particularly if they're in early in career, it can put them at a disadvantage. So I feel like I can totally see the value. Don't get me wrong, I use them, but be considerate and compassionate towards that candidate in their situation. You might want to get it done by the end of the week, but they've got their own life. So if they want to push it to the next week, just be understanding of that. I think more than anything. And ideally, where possible, build that into the interview process itself so that they're not having to do too much outside of work. So at Armour CUNY, we do a pairing task. The most they have to do in advance is to make sure they get their setup correctly so that they can screen share, they can do all the things that they want, and to download all the relevant bits and pieces. But the task itself is in the interview. But there are others where we've absolutely had to do it in outside of hours, and then it's presenting. But then it's let's give them the breakdown of what it is they're being assessed on. Again, you want to make it feel yes, it's an interview, but they're you're giving them an opportunity to shine rather than trying to catch them out. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's the message as well. As one of the key messages from this is that we are trying to give candidates the best possible platform to be the best possible version of themselves in that process. And final question, and Rachel, I'll stay with you on this one. From what you've seen and what you've implemented, have you seen any direct correlation between improving that interview process and candidate experience to quality of hire, however it is you may measure that?
Yes. Like if you're building in structure, whether it was there or not before, right? But if you're building in structure into your process in itself, it should mean that you're covering more of those key aspects of the role. That should tell you whether or not that person is a good hire. So that alone should mean that you're getting a better quality of hire as a result. I think when you then factor in all the training and all the other things that you're trying to do and getting everybody on the same page, again, like it should mean that you're getting a better quality of hire. We all make dud hires. Like, let's not pretend like it absolutely happens. It doesn't matter how much you cover. Like, some people are not always going to be open around how they present themselves, or actually, you know what, there's always going to be an anomaly regardless of how you interview. Accept that. And make sure that you're covering all your metrics and make sure that they are the anomaly as opposed to the norm. But I do think that like just building in that structure in itself should mean that you improve the quality of hire. But outside of quality of hire, if by doing that, you're improving the candidate experience, you're showcasing more about what the company is like, what the values of those company are like. They're getting to meet more people, they're getting to ask more questions. That alone should mean that the candidates themselves also self-select out when they realize this is what it's going to be like, or this is not what it's going to be like, and whether they want to do it or not. So there's kind of two parts of us being able to assess in the right way, but the candidate also assessing us and making sure that they are choosing to go to the right place. There's no point putting on a facade and then on day one they arrive and they're like, oh, this is not what I was expecting. Like, it might be a great hire, but if they hate it there, they're going to leave anyway. So like, ask in the interview, make sure it's clear in the interview process. So I think that's really key.
Thanks, Rachel. And Matthew, final, same question to you, really. Have you, as you're kind of putting together and improving the interview process at Source, have you seen any correlation to the impact of people are able to make when they join the company and their success?
It's been very clear, actually. And it's not to say that people we hired before we had an interview process are less strong than people than after we had the interview process. I think it's more just the work that went in to find strong candidates, and the time and effort, in a sense, to find strong candidates was a much more efficient process. I mean, before we didn't have any LinkedIn recruiter account, which now we do. We didn't have, we're actually just building a career page finally, which will give people more access to what we're doing. I mean, every step we take, I think, has shown even a small progression in the quality of hire we made. I mean, every hire we've made seems to get faster and faster, more efficient, stronger and stronger. We're getting our name out there more. I mean, employer branding is becoming a huge part of not just people, but the people work, but recruiting in general, because we are representing that, our employer brand. As Rekha said, I mean, this is our culture screening is not only an interview, for us to speak to the candidate, but I split the time half and half. I give them 15 minutes to ask me questions and tell me about them, and I take 15 minutes to tell them about the company and myself and the role. So we want it to be a two-way interview. And I think building that into the process, not just in the interview, but in also how we communicate through our job posts and other things with, here in New York and the US, transparency laws are changing the game, right? So frankly, it takes out almost an entire interview sometimes now that we just have to post the range on our salary band on the job description. I mean, we're not the kind of group that's saying 50K to 250K and letting them guess, right? If we have a role, we're putting a 20 to 30, maybe 40K range if there's like a big, gap of who we could hire. But every single thing we do in the process to make it more efficient, salary bands on job descriptions, LinkedIn Recruiter, ATS being implemented now, we've seen a very clear impact of quality of hire. And I guess we'll know more in 3 to 6 months, since we don't have any full-time W-2 hires here in the US that have been here longer than 4 or 5 months. So I think we're still seeing it, myself included. And so I think we're still seeing a lot of that. But there's no doubt in my mind that when an effort is actually put forth towards building an efficient, effective, inclusive, diverse, there's probably 20 different adjectives I can use there, but interview process, the quality of hire follows. I mean, you start to see not just quality of hire, but quality of candidates. Like you speak to people, the group that you're speaking to is better. You don't need to speak to 25, 30 people. You can speak to 6, 7, 8 people and find a good candidate in that group because you know what you're looking for more, more of your target, you have more employer branding to offer and to show. Absolutely. I think totally answer. The long answer would be yes, Paul. I think that's the long answer here. Yes, definitely.
Fantastic. Rekha, did you have something to add there? Look like you were going to.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about it at all, but like a key aspect of all the stuff we've talked about, great, but you need to get your stakeholders on board. You need to get all the people in the interview process involved, and it often requires a cultural mind shift. CEO or fellow exec know your opinion isn't the only one that counts anymore. Like people being able to step away from being in the detail all the time in itself is a challenge. And effectively, particularly as recruiters, what we're trying to do is build a process that will scale. So it's not just trying to make a process that works now when we're 20 people or when we get to 50. It's being able to make a process that we can edit and adjust as we get to 100, 200 people. So getting that stakeholder buy-in into what and why we're doing something, I think is really key in order to be able to make all the other stuff that we've talked about really important.
Totally.
Yeah, I'm with you. Thank you so much. Right, and I think that's a good place to finish up. So next week, we obviously just finished off on a question there about quality hire. Next week, we're going to be talking about how to take our TA metrics and speak in the commercial language that the rest of the business understands, it's particularly those stakeholders like you were talking about just a minute ago, Rekha. But thank you so much for doing this today. Thank you for locking on to the listeners. But Rekha, Matthew, thank you so much for sharing so many insights. And we appreciate you.
It was
a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Hope to speak to you both soon.
Likewise.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.